Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first Lunch and Learn. My name is Emily Todd. I am the Administrative Coordinator at the California Association of Museums. And before I turn things over to our presenters today, I'm going to go over a few technical things with you. So on the side of your screen, you should have a toolbar that is identical or similar to the one that you see on our slide here. On the top of that screen is your webcam and audio. And for the sake of a smooth webinar today, I have turned off all of our attendees' webcams and audios and left those reserved for our presenters. Also on that toolbar, you will see a Materials tab. In that Materials tab, you can actually find the PowerPoint that we are using today during the webinar. If you'd like to download that, feel free. And then at the bottom of the screen, you will see the chat box. The chat box can be used at any time for any questions that you have for our presenters, but keep in mind we do have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so we do encourage you to hang on to your questions until that point. This webinar today is also being recorded just for CAM archives here, and I'm going to bow out now and turn things over to our program manager, Jessica Monahan. Jessica?
Good morning, everyone, and I want to say thank you all for being here. This Lunch and Learn is a new pilot program that CAM is trying out this year as an opportunity to bring content directly to you at your museum. I want to thank all of our panelists today, Wendy Abelmann, who's the Director of Education and Public Programs at the Oceanside Museum of Art, Katherine Herman, the Education Outreach Manager at the Autry Museum of the American West, and Amy Davis, the Development Manager for the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History, who also serves as a museum consultant. I'm excited to bring this content to all of you, but it's also important at the end of this that we receive some evaluation information from you. An hour after this webinar, you'll receive an evaluation and post-event survey. Please go ahead and fill that out so we can get some more information and we continue to bring content to you in your museum, easy access for everybody. I want to pass it off to Amy Davis right now. Amy, thank you so much for helping organize this and being our partner today.
Okay, hopefully my microphone's on.
We can hear you great.
Okay, we can all hear. Great. Okay, so thank you, Jessica and Emily. This is great. Thank you. Okay. I'm really pleased to be participating today with my co-presenters, Katherine and Wendy. We were fortunate enough to present this, this session, How Can I Relate to That? Empathy is a New Lens for Learning in Sacramento last March, and we're so excited to be able to share our presentation with you today over this webinar. So I'm just going to kind of dive right in and talk about, well, here are our presenters. So if, you know, Jessica did a great job introducing everybody. We'll also provide our contact information towards the end. You know, we would love to stay in touch. We've been in touch with a couple of folks since our session, and, you know, it's just been really great. So we're sharing our slideshow right now, right? No. Okay. Hold on. Let me do that. Okay. I think I'm going to, sorry, folks. Hold on just a moment. We're going to pause this just a minute. I don't want you to see all my multiple tabs that I always have open.
Amy, if you'd like, I'd happy to do the slides for you.
Sure, that'd be great. All right, thank you, Jessica. Okay. All right, so like I was saying, we're going to be sharing our contact information after, towards the end of the presentation. So thank you. So just what we're going to do today, we're going to hear from Wendy about a program that she ran at History San Jose called History Detectives. And, you know, and then we're going to also hear from Katherine Herman at the Autry Museum about her oral history project, helping participants see history through a new perspective. So we're going to hear about those 2 case studies, but first I'm going to help define empathy a little bit, talk about sort of what some of the current dialogue is on the subject. We'll hear the 2 case studies, we'll wrap it up, and then have a chance for a 10-minute or so Q&A, and hopefully we'll hear from you about what your thoughts are on empathy in museums and what you're currently doing to build that into your program. So I think we're going to move on to the next slide. All right, we're going to talk about what is empathy. Great, thanks. So we have Roman Zarnarak, who's the founder of the Empathy Museum, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, about what they do. He defines empathy as the art of stepping into the shoes of another person and looking at the world from their perspective. It's about understanding the thoughts, the feelings, the ideas, and experience that make up their view of the world. And so we also want to kind of contextualize, why empathy is an important skill to cultivate. I'm sure we're all on board with that idea, that it is important. And then talk a little bit about why museums are the perfect place for that skill building. But we know that empathy is an important skill to build for 21st century skills. We're in industries where collaboration and teamwork are highly valued and very important, and we need that emotional intelligence to work with one another, to empathize with each other's standpoints, backgrounds, to work together and to collaborate. We want to also understand other viewpoints. In 2006, Barack Obama said, there's a lot of talk in this country about the federal deficit, but I think we should talk about the empathy deficit. The ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to see the world through the eyes of those who are different from us, the child who's hungry, the steel worker who's been laid off, the family who lost the entire life they built together when the storm came to town. When you think like this, when you choose to broaden your ambit of concern and empathize with the plight of others, whether they're close friends or distant strangers, it becomes harder not to act, harder not to help. It can help us build a civil society by having empathy with one another. And it's a muscle. We have to practice. We can role play to help develop this skill. However, we also know that it's poorly defined, poorly understood, and rarely taught. I don't know if any of you had units on empathy or emotional intelligence in school, and I certainly didn't, but it's one of those skills that we kind of talk about sometimes and hope that is happening, but how do we consciously become more empathetic? So thinking about why empathy is important and critical in museum programs in particular, we think that museums are uniquely positioned to address empathy. And I'm going to refer to Mike Morosky in his blog, Art Museum Teaching. He says, yes, museums are institutions that hold collections, but they can also serve a powerful role with our communities as active spaces for connection and coming together, for conversation and dialogue, for listening and sharing. Museums can be spaces for individual stories and community voices. They can be a space for acknowledging and reflecting on differences and for bridging divides. They can be spaces for growth, struggle, love, and hope. So if I could have the next slide. We'd like you to consider the mission of 2 museums today, because a lot of times our museum missions are aligned with the goal of perspective taking, connecting with one another, bringing awareness to new issues, ideas, subjects. For History San Jose, where Wendy worked and is going to talk about her program, History Detectives, their mission, I know you can read that there on your screen, to preserve and enrich the cultural heritage of San Jose and the Santa Clara Valley through research collections, partnerships, educational programs, and events. And then the Autry, bringing together the stories of all peoples of the American West, connecting the past with the present to inspire our shared future. So museums, we'd like to argue today, are a safe place to explore other points of view, cultures, and histories. And today we're talking about 2 history museums in particular, and how history, being the study of particular people and their lives and past struggles, that they are uniquely positioned to help teach and build this empathy muscle. They have things that people of the past owned and used, things that sometimes we still use today. So it helps us make that bridge to the past. So if I could go back to the previous slide. We're almost ready to move on to Wendy. So presenters from these two history museums will share how their education programs in particular cultivate empathy. They'll talk about perspective taking, seeing history through multiple perspectives. And some programs were kind of a single one-time program, and some are still in development, but continue to influence how we work in even other institutions, on different programs and even in other institutions. And we'd like to invite you that as you hear these two case studies, please think about how your programs use similar components. We can talk about them during the Q&A. I also just wanted to make a side note that we're talking too about building empathy in our audience, also building empathy as a skill in ourselves. In my work with Wendy training interpreters at History San Jose, we focused on teaching the interpreters how not only to teach empathy, but to have empathy for their audience and for themselves as teachers. So we'd like to say that that's equally important, that empathy for the age grade characteristics of our audience or empathy for ourselves as educators is also important. And so we hope to answer the question, can empathy be taught and how? What are some models for that? And I think now I'll turn it over to Wendy, who will share her efforts towards teaching and modeling empathy at History San Jose. So we'll take the next slide and turn it over to Wendy. Thank you.
Okay, am I on right now? Can you hear me?
We can hear you
We
loud
can
and
hear
clear.
you, Wendy.
Okay. I'm so sorry. Okay, so you got the slide presentation, you can hear me. I just want to make sure it's been this is my little disclaimer that I'm in Hawaii on vacation with my family. My kids might run in their bathing suits at any point, so I'm just trying to prepare for that. And also I've had about 10 cups of macadamia nut coffee, so this could go in many directions. Let's hope it goes in the right one though. But thank you so much for joining us today, and I wanted to just continue what Amy was saying, how I think museums are really uniquely just positioned to teach empathy and perspective taking, and a program that I started at History San Jose called History Detectives. And I wanted to share a bit of my personal journey into sort of the world of social cognition, which kind of influenced me redeveloping a program that I did at History San Jose in order to have more of an empathetic lens. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, sort of both personally and professionally. And let's move on to the next slideshow, which is the next slide, which is only going to make sense if we were at the presentation. We did this in Sacramento. I was thinking a lot about thought bubbles and how in the teaching of history, it really is a lot about our internal thoughts. A lot of times we focus on the outside world, and in teaching empathy, we really need to do just the opposite and start from the inside world. And the inside world to me, and especially in teaching kids, is so much about our internal thoughts. And I look at the world as like, I have this internal thought bubble above my head. So during the presentation in Sacramento, I was thinking that, what was the audience thinking about me? What was I thinking about the audience? I'm sure, just your thought processes today about perhaps joining us on this webinar. I'm sure you were like, do I have time? Would I rather eat lunch outside than sit at my desk and watch this presentation? So many different thoughts that were going through your head as you were deciding on this. And part of that in looking at empathy is really thinking, or perspective taking is thinking about really the first stage of that is just thinking that we all have thoughts and feelings, and that's in beginning from there. And I really taught my teaching strategy from that viewpoint, that we all start with thoughts and feelings. What are we thinking? What are we feeling? That it's an incredibly challenging world to navigate your internal thought process, and how this leads then to empathy. So on the next slide. So certainly this is really true for me about the places we go inform what we do. let's see, went through a museum education program. I taught at varying museums for 14 years and felt I was pretty, or felt somewhat secure in my ability to know all about museum education and, all the things that we have, our practices like inquiry-based learning and constructivism and scaffolding and all these approaches to teaching kids. Felt somewhat secure in that. And then I had my own two children and sort of entered a different world. Never did I anticipate both my kids would have spectrum-related issues, and I would be going to tons and tons of different therapies, feeling very bewildered. My first about 7 years of life with my kids, so going to occupational therapy and physical therapy and all these different things, and learning about this other world, which was really this social cognitive world, which for kids on the spectrum or that might have challenges, social cognitive deficits, have such a hard time navigating that social world. And one of the most influential programs that I went to was a program called Social Thinking. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But that program actually tied in with the learning that I had developed in museum education and perfectly sort of came together to help me rethink not only the way that I raise my kids and view the world, but just also to rethink programs that I do in museums. So on to the next slide. So social thinking was developed by Michelle Garcia Winner in the 60s, 70s. And she really, what her goal was is that, she dealt a lot in the schools in talking with people with speech deficits, but not speech deficits in the sense of articulation, but more in the way of how people socialize with one another. And our social world is so incredibly complex, and she felt that teaching kids by memorization, which is what they were pretty much doing before, they were teaching the skills in terms of socializing, but not realizing that in every social situation, you're going to be presented with different things. So why not teach them the actual thinking behind that, the thinking behind the social, which some people, it naturally comes to them in that social world, which is great. For so many people, it's really challenging to navigate that social world. So what this group and organization does is they break down that complexity of the social world. They really take it apart, they analyze every piece of it and put it back together in this way that is really concrete for every child and adult to understand and help them navigate better their social world. And how does this have to do with empathy and perspective taking? Really, again, I think everything, because we all, again, it all starts with our inner world, our thoughts and our feelings and how we relate with one another. And I think so often, and what it encouraged is, which really tied nicely with my program later on, but it encourages kids to be social detectives, to really think about others, how they're thinking, what they're doing, and to investigate that in order to understand their social world. And why is this important, especially in museum education? For me, it's like we expect kids to, as I say, interpret, infer, share, during a field trip experience, but do we ever actively teach this? Can we teach empathy? Can we teach perspective taking? So if you want to move to the next slide. So what I was challenged with is I was already doing a program at History San Jose, and this was, I worked for 14 years, raised my kids for 7 years, still raising my kids, but did go back to the museum world. And one of the first programs I worked on with History Detectives was I developed a program to try to help kids relate to this portrait of Johnny Kirk, which was a kid that lived 160 years ago in San Jose, had kind of similar experiences to them. But I kept thinking, as every educator does, how can I make them really relate to that and think about how this person's feeling and think about how they related with someone in history. And the program first began with the objective of kids learning primary source documents. Through learning about objects and primary source documents, kids can learn about the past. That was kind of my basic premise. I know that's a sort of generic objective that many programs might have, but it sort of started off that way, but became something very different as I evaluated the program and how I infused empathy in there. So look at the next slide. So we have the History Detectives program started off, again, students learned about the past through artifacts and primary source documents. And as I was doing this program, yes, kids related to it and they did get something from it. I just still didn't feel that the point in my head where I thought, oh, they're going to immediately empathize with this child, is because one of the main components of the program, too, at the end, they're studying this portrait of Johnny Kirk. And at the end, they realize this is a posthumous portrait, that he had died. He was riding a horse and fell off his horse. And at the end, they realize that after kind of looking through his whole life. And did I expect there to be like immediate empathy? Absolutely, I thought that. But then knowing fifth graders, I would have conversations like, you know, is Johnny a zombie? Does he live in the archives of your museum? Is he haunting people? And it wasn't what I was going for, although I realized that is sort of the fifth grade mindset too. So we would kind of have conversations surrounding that too. But I thought, again, how can I make them really understand and relate with this 10-year-old boy beyond the things and objects that he had, but to really tie into that inside world of Johnny Kirk. So on to the next slide. So what I really did was I sat down and looked at the program and I thought, you know, instead of thinking that I want them to learn empathy or to use empathetic skills and perspective taking, this is going to be an active part of the program. This is one of my main objectives above all, and I'm really going to make that very clear in my programming. So I did a whole analysis and looked at what kids like. They like the artifacts. They like the thought of being a detective and thoughtful dialogue. And then we had it in the collection center at the museum and feeling like historians. But they didn't really understand, though, you know, why are we studying about him still? What was he famous? And yeah, he played marbles. I guess I've seen that. There really still wasn't that that huge connection. And there was these concepts that I felt were missing to let them really understand how Johnny felt. And they were always wanting to get, again, it was very much their focus on that outside world, like they wanted to get the right answer, as opposed to just thinking about things or making smart guesses about things. So if you come to the next slide. Is that how do we make empathy the goal and outcome? So I really decided to focus more on those ideas. Like, okay, yeah, let's talk about why was Johnny famous? Let's infuse more of the tools for perspective taking and social thinking skills that I learned from them into this program. So if you look at the next slide. I'm going to talk to you a bit about two things that I use then from the social thinking world that Michelle Garcia Winter had developed, this program she developed, and how I used it in History Detectives to teach perspective taking. So one of them was people files. And so what my kids did when they went to these social cognition classes through Michelle Garcia Winter was she would have them develop files on different people. So for instance, a lot of kids that have social cognitive deficits, they spend a lot of time talking about themselves or things that they like, but they can't look into the other person's world and think about what they like. And so she developed these files in order to have people find out about what their friends liked. And so they would make a file on a person and they would write down what they liked, what their favorite movie is, their color, their favorite colors, all those things. And they would sort of store those files in their brain. And then the next time they would meet that person, instead of just talking about themselves, they would remember, okay, I remember that person likes horses. I'm going to ask them something about their horse or whatever it might be so they can relate to that. So I decided, why don't we make a people file about Johnny Kirk, who lived in the past? And so one of their pre-lessons was making a file first starting from themselves. So you can see that on the next one, on the next slide, in which this came home as this was a pre-visit lesson, so it came to their teacher, and they had to first create a file on themselves and everything that they liked to learn about, the objects that were important to them, and then it even asked them to think about what a person from 100 years in the future might think about what they're thinking about or what their objects might mean. So with this people file, they were really able to put themselves in the place of sort of Johnny Kirk, understand sort of all that. And then when they came to the museum, we did together a large people file, which they were already familiar with, about Johnny Kirk. So we answered the same exact questions they'd asked about themselves, now about Johnny Kirk. And one of the things that I also incorporated in there so that they wouldn't always focus on making the right answer, they were always so concerned, am I getting the right answer? Because again, they looked at history as about facts and dates and things to get right, as opposed to about people. And that's what I'm always still fascinated about, is that you can ask kids, what is history? And generally the comments you always get are, you know, mummies and dinosaurs and dead people and stuff from the past, as opposed to that it's about, you know, history is about people. No one said it's about how we think about others. History itself is very much lends itself to perspective taking. So another thing that we did was incorporate the smart guess, which is when looking at Johnny Kirk, when looking at his things, I asked them to, and I love the language smart guess. It's different than, you know, like hypothesizing or things like that. I really asked them to, you know, you're guessing about something because you're not quite sure. We're all not sure exactly a lot of things in history, what happened, or especially when you're looking at a portrait, what might be, but that they're gonna guess smartly about what they're thinking about. So in this case, Johnny was with his dog. He's sort of touching his dog's hair, and then I asked them to sort of hear and think about what they might hear in San Jose in this sort of bucolic setting he was in, and that, you know, how would they feel? And most of them had dogs. They could relate to that, and so most of them could make the smart guess that Johnny liked dogs. He probably had fun with them on the farm, and definitely use that as an empathy building piece as well. So the next slide. So I love this quote. I just wanted to end with this before the last slide, is to, again, I think the building blocks of perspective taking or empathy is really starting first with that we all have thoughts and feelings. That's what makes us human. That's what gives us that human experience. And it also to focus more not on the outside world, which is, I think, what a lot of in school we do. We focus on the outside world, again, the facts and the, you know, information, as opposed to that inside world of what we're feeling. And if we could learn about things in that way, I think it would completely change our world. And I love what Ken Robinson has said: we only know the world around us through the world within us, through the sense by which we perceive it and the ideas by which we make sense of it. And the last slide just tells you a bit about social thinking. And you're welcome to look up their website. They have some wonderful ideas and strategies. Again, it is more focused on people with social cognitive deficits, but it's amazing how what they have done and the programs that they developed to teach people really in terms of social situations, how that can be applied to empathy and how it can be applied to any child, any adult, into learning how to take the perspective of another. I think it's an incredibly powerful program. Thank you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Katherine, you're loud and clear.
Great. Excellent. Hi everybody, my name is Katherine Herman and I'm the Education Outreach Manager at the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. Today I'm going to be talking to you about an outreach program that we did here at the Autry a couple of years ago. As I mentioned, I'm the Education Outreach Manager. Our education department here at the Autry has two branches. We have our on-site branch and our off-site branch, and so my role here is to sort of manage all of the education activities that happen out in the community, or really anything that isn't an on-site field trip. The program that I'm going to be telling you about today is what we call an Introduction to Empathy project. And you'll see what I mean sort of as we talk about what this project looked like. So the nice thing about this project that I'm going to be telling you about is that the structure is easily replicable. It's pretty simple. And so if any of you are interested in starting an empathy project in your education departments, possibly with a partner school, this is a really easy one to get started with. So hopefully you'll take something from it. So let's start talking. Our mission statement here at the Autry, as Amy said earlier, really sort of has empathy built into it. Our mission says, and I'm going to read it so I don't butcher it, our mission says that the Autry brings together the stories of all peoples of the American West, connecting the past with the present to inspire our shared future. This is a lofty goal. Inspiring a shared future is, I think, something that all of us, especially those of us who work in education, want to help people understand and fulfill. But it's very hard to do. And so the way that we try to tackle that here at the Autry is twofold. The first thing that we try to do here in our education department to fulfill our mission statement is to really focus on individual people. So just like Wendy did with her project, we try to focus on one individual or a small group of individuals to really help people make those personal connections. But we all know that just because we learn about someone in history or we learn about something that people did, it doesn't necessarily mean that we empathize with that person. So the next thing that we try to do with students is we try to bring in universal values. So we'll start with the person in history, and then we'll bring in these values that everyone can relate to. If any of you are educators out there, you know that you hear all the time, "Miss, why do I have to learn about this? It happened like 100 years ago." And even as adults, sometimes it's hard to find all of history relevant. And so that's where these universal values really come in. So we pull out things like happiness, struggle, freedom, fairness, and we match these values with the people in history to really try to scaffold that learning process and really drive that empathy home. So there are a couple of things that sparked this project. This was a project we did with Arroyo Seco Museum Science Magnet School that's near our museum, and it was with the 7th grade class. And we had recently finished an in-gallery Civil War program that focused on perspective taking. In other words, we were having students learn about the Civil War, and the way that we were doing that was we were assigning them a person in history. And they were learning about that person, and we had them think about, what would this person's experiences have been, and how did they feel, and what decisions do you think they made based on who they were and what kind of life they had. And so this was a perspective taking exercise that we did in our Civil War program. And we noticed that this was the first time that we really saw students empathizing with people in history more so than we had ever seen with any of our other programs. And so we kind of wanted to run with this idea of empathy building in programs, and we decided to incorporate it into our outreach programming. Another reason this program came about, if you can hop back to the previous slide for just a moment, thanks, is that there was an uptick in office conversations about unity, kindness, and empathy. It was something that was buzzing in the media, in the news, around the museum, and so we started listening and thinking, empathy is something that we're hearing all the time. It's always been important, but now even more so, and how do we echo what we're hearing through our programming and really make sure that what we're presenting to our community is what they need and is relevant. And third, as a museum educator, all of us here, we have a vested interest in our communities and in community identity. We want to help people sort of find their identity within their community, and we thought this project would be a great way to go. So we can hop to the next slide. What we did was we decided that we were going to reach out to a partner teacher at Arroyo Seco Museum Science Magnet School and sort of propose this project to him. The project basically, well, I'll get to it. So the first thing we do was we said, hey, we are going to work together this year. We have this idea. We want to do a project that is rooted in empathy. What do you think? He loved the idea. And so we brought it up to the students and we said, what are you interested in? What kind of things do you want to study? And themselves and family were really big themes that kept coming up. So we thought, okay, we'll have everybody look into their family. And together with the students, we landed on a compelling question that was going to drive this project. And after many iterations, that question wound up being, why are you here? And so we decided, again, this would be an oral history project where students would have to talk to people in their family about things that maybe they had never spoke about before. So the question was, why are you here? And together with the students, we talked about open-ended questions. We talked about what are some oral history techniques. What does it mean to be an interviewer? What does it mean to be an interviewee? We went over everything from crafting questions that would help them understand their family members to talking about how do you make your subject comfortable, and we sent students home with recording devices. The picture here on the PowerPoint slide is the exact recorder that we sent students home with. I think they're less than $30 on Amazon, which is great. So students went home and they picked a family member to interview, to ask these questions. You know, why are you here? How did you get to this community? What was your experience like? And they went off and they did the interviews. The next step in the process was to organize the information and synthesize everything. So once students brought their interviews back to the classroom, they transcribed everything, and together as a class, we looked at all of the interviews and started pulling out things that we saw over and over. So what are some recurring themes that we see? What are some interview moments that are maybe unique to some interviewees and we don't see in others? And what we had students do was pull out, again, universal themes. And what we saw happening was that almost all of the interviews had something about needing to leave to find safety or wanting a better future for their family. And that was really interesting. That was something that these 7th grade students hadn't really thought about before. I think a lot of times, I mean, adults are guilty of this too. We have people who are close to us in our lives who we don't really think necessarily about what has their life been like and what have they experienced and how does that shape this individual as a person. And so this was a rare moment for these young people to sit down with some, you know, people who are in their families who they had not had these conversations with before. So once we had synthesized all of our information and decided on these larger themes in class, students then created artwork. They wanted visual representations of the stories that they had found. And then we prepared to present to our audience. If you want to skip to the next slide. We had an exhibit opening in the classroom. And the way we did it was we loaded these oral histories, these recordings, onto computers, and the room was a very simple setup. You see there are just 7 computers here in a circle. The room was designed with the intent to be a quiet space where people could come and listen to these stories and hear stories that might be different from their own, similar to their own. So here you see we're building the empathy block. So we start with students listening to each other, and then we start with adults hearing the stories of other people in their community who they may never have met before. So we're going to hop to the next slide. So this is what the exhibition opening looked like. We invited parents, other teachers, school administrators to come into the classroom. The woman with the green lanyard there is Nicole Martinez, one of our outreach associates. She led the program in the classroom. And next to her is the classroom teacher. So there were a couple of speeches from adults. You can see family members here listening to the oral histories. If you want to go to the next slide. We also had students who were positioned outside of the classroom. So as guests walked up to the classroom, the students could give them an idea about what they would see inside. You see we have a greeter at the door who's interacting with a visitor, letting him know what he's going to see inside. You can go to the next slide. And so there were a lot of significant takeaways from this kind of project. The first thing that we learned is that empathy is multifaceted. We know that we cannot teach empathy in 55 minutes or even in a semester-long project, but what we learned through this project is that it's worth it to try. The example of the Civil War program that I talked about earlier, that was perspective taking, right? So we were asking students to sort of put themselves in the shoes of people in history. With this project, with the 7th graders, we were practicing perspective recognition. So we weren't asking students to step into the shoes of their interviewee. All we were asking was that you sit down with somebody and you start to recognize that there is somebody close to you who has a story that you may never have heard before. Core values are a very important part of the conversation. Again, we saw things like education, safety, family, better future coming up over and over again from these interviews. And lastly, and I know Amy and Wendy both talked about this, but empathy is a muscle. You know, we can't expect that these 7th graders, after having gone through this project, will be the most empathetic people on the planet, but we do know that we have done our part to introduce these students to empathy and what it means, and we can hope that you know, they're better for it. And, you know, a cute picture of all the students doesn't hurt. So this is just a reiteration sort of the other takeaways. The one thing I didn't mention was that we gave students ownership of their own learning in this project, which gets a lot of buy-in, which is always nice. And then this, I believe, is Amy's slide.
Hi again. Wow, Wendy and Catherine, thank you so much for sharing those case studies. And you know, I love this idea that, you know, we can help build empathy as a skill in museums, and that it's not like a box to check. It's a skill, it's a muscle that we need to exercise, and we can contribute to that through our programs. So as in a way to wrap up, I wanted to share a couple of resources that helped us frame and articulate what we wanted to talk about today. So the Empathetic Museum represents the collective work of museum professionals dedicated to a more inclusive future for the museum industry. And it was a collaboration that grew out of a bunch of informal conversations at AAM in 2014 at an unconference. And they ask, how could we as an industry approach the need for greater equality and representation using empathy as our lens? They also have further reading and downloads, including steps to make your museum more empathetic and an assessment tool. I love how a lot of these cohorts are developing assessment tools and toolkits for us to use in our whatever kind of leadership role we have within our museums. There's the Empathy Museum that I referred to earlier, and the Incluseum, founded by Althea Whitman and Rose Packett-Kinsley, advances new ways of being a museum through critical discourse, community building, and collaborative practice related to inclusion in museums. Great blog. I referenced Mike's art museum teaching, and lately Mike has been talking a lot about museums are not neutral and sort of how museums can best position themselves in various ways in their communities with the various social and political issues that are happening in our world. So very valuable blog if you don't already follow it. And Museum Questions with Rebecca Hertz is also really great, kind of posing a lot of issues and questions that she deals with in the Children's Museum. A couple other points there too, and we'd love to know in the chat box if there are resources that you use for building empathy or other 21st century skills into your programs. We'd love to benefit from those from you. So, and let's see, let's do the next slide, please. Okay, well, there's our contact information, and how about we go to the next slide and we can come back to this one so you can, well, you have this downloadable for yourself in that material section. So here we have a quote from Museum Hack: "The fun and creative nature of museums makes them a space for exercising our empathy muscles and helping inspire empathy in others." So just as another kind of parting thought, although these case studies are so inspiring and impactful, I'm kind of left with the question, why must empathy be solely in the realm of education? I know that we have the public interface component, right, within education departments. But are there other departments that should contribute to this? And especially as an institutional priority, are there other aspects of our museum operations that can adopt empathy more overtly? So what about staff management? You know, museums are made of people, of course, and the best museum leaders recognize the challenging work-life balance that dedicated employees must constantly calibrate. And so how can we build those positive work environments to retain highly skilled and expert staff in our institutions? I couldn't help but think about empathy in development, because that's my current role is in fundraising at the Santa Cruz Museum of Natural History. And in my current role, I like to bring sort of the soft skills from museum education into my work. And I like to consider everyone a stakeholder in the future of the institution, no matter what their giving level is. We try to implement that personal touch in everything we do. You know, and collections management and curatorial can also be civically minded, working with the community to make museum collections and exhibits relevant and dynamic. So while the most obvious place we can promote empathy is through education programs, there's more work to do because, of course, it's arguably one of the most important skills that we can help contribute to in our field. So with that, I think we are open for questions and would love to, you know, I think some of the questions we posed to you, the audience, were things like, you know, how can empathy in museums kind of connect? How can your programs build empathy, and what are some maybe ways that you want to integrate empathy into what you're doing more overtly? And then if you have resources you'd like to share with the group, we'd love to benefit from those as well. So thank you, everyone, to especially the CAM staff and Wendy and Catherine for helping us have this lunch and learn today. I think it was a great experience. So thank you.
And if you have questions, please go ahead and type those into your chat box. I want to make sure we get if there are questions, we get the chance to answer them. I also want to go back to our slide that Wendy, Catherine, and Amy's contact information is available for you. I'm not seeing any questions right now. So I'm going to continue moving forward just in the thought of time, as everyone's probably getting close to the end of their lunch hour. I also want to say a big thanks to Amy, Catherine, and Wendy for going ahead and trying this pilot program with us. During the 2017 CAM conference, this session was one that came widely recommended and had really great reviews, both during the conference as well as in post-conference surveys. So I'm really grateful we're able to bring this content to you at a place that's convenient for you wherever you might be here today. Before we sign off, I just want to remind everybody that within the next hour, you'll be receiving the post-program evaluation. Please fill this out. It's not specific necessarily to the content presented today, but about what we can do and what kind of content we can provide in the future through these lunch and learn program activities. So please participate in that, give us some feedback, and let us know how we can meet you where you are. I also want to take the opportunity today to thank all of our CAM members. Without the support of these individuals, institutions, and businesses, learning opportunities like these and others would not be possible. If you or your organization would like information on becoming a member, please visit our website, calmuseums.org, to learn more. Your membership supports learning opportunities like this, as well as resources and services available to the entire California Museum community. So thank you. I want to pass it off. Many of you may be planning already to attend the 2018 conference, February 5th through 7th, 2018 in Palm Springs. It's a beautiful time of year to be in the desert, and I hope to see as many of you as possible. But if you haven't already signed on, I want to encourage you to get excited and take a look at this video. It'll hopefully wet your whistle for what's to come. Thank you all for attending. We're going to close with this video and then sign off.